Here with me today, I have two of my EFCN colleagues, Shadi Eskoff and Glenn Barnes. Both are Senior Project Directors at the Environmental Finance Center at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Welcome and good afternoon, Shadi and Glenn.
Thank you, Aura. This is Glenn Barnes. This is Shadi Eskoff. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Just before we get to your questions, I wanted to give you a quick overview of the project. I know many of you have attended our webinars or education events in the past, but we are the Environmental Finance Center Network. We are made up of several centers around the country based at universities. And this particular project that we have with EPA, we call Smart Management for Small Water Systems. And this is part of the funding that EPA provides for training and technical assistance for water systems serving 10,000 or fewer people. In particular, our team has the finance and management slice of the pie, and our good colleagues at RCAP and Rural Water have the technical slices of the pie. And so we work in every state and territory and in the Navajo Nation as well with small drinking water systems, providing training and one-on-one assistance. Some of the areas that we work on today, we're going to be focusing a lot on financial management, fiscal planning, and rate setting, but we also have work in asset management, in the energy management of water systems, in leadership, managing drought, managing your water loss, collaborating and partnering with neighboring systems, accessing multiple sources of funding, workforce development, climate resiliency, and water conservation. We will have several other webinars upcoming throughout the year on these subjects, and so we encourage you to join us for those and also for our in-person workshops on these subjects. And as I mentioned, we are a network of centers based largely at universities across the country. Shadi and I are at the Environmental Finance Center at the University of North Carolina. We are co-leads on the project with our colleagues at the Southwest Environmental Finance Center at University of New Mexico. Laura joins us from the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center, who is the kind of management lead on the project. And then we have centers at Wichita State, EFC West, University of Louisville, Cleveland State, University of Southern Maine, and then our very important partners at American Water Works Association, AWWA, who help us with this project. And so for today's forum, typically when we do webinars, we are coming to present on a subject that we have chosen, and we'll give you an hour in depth on it. But for today, we wanted to do something a little bit different. We wanted to address directly the questions that you as small water systems have. And so for those of you, when you registered, you had an opportunity to submit us questions. And so we are thankful for those. We will be addressing as many of those as possible. And then, of course, here on the webcast today, as Laura mentioned, please use the questions box to submit even more questions to us. And if for some reason we're not able to get to all of them, and we got quite a bit of them in the early going here, we will be happy to address them by email directly to you after the fact. So that's the name of the game today is you ask and we well, try to answer anyway. And so before we get into that, though, we want to know a little bit more about you, who's on the call today. So we have a couple of polling questions for you. And Laura, if you could go ahead and launch that first poll for us, that would be great.
All right. So the first poll we have is, what kind of water and or sewer utility do you represent? We have the answers of for-profit, municipality, not-for-profit, special purpose district, or not a water or sewer utility. And I'll just give a couple seconds for everyone to send their answers in.
While you're answering this question, we know that there are a lot of people who do not represent it or don't work for a water system. You are absolutely welcome to submit questions as well, ask us questions during this webinar. The point is to work with anybody who sets rates, reviews finances, works with water systems as well, both from the inside and the outside as well. So if you are a regulator or if you are a consultant that works with small water systems, you're more than welcome to submit your questions as well.
All right. Here are the results.
All right, so Looks like we have about a third of the people coming from municipal systems. A third are folks who work in state and local, state and federal government and for the consulting community. And then the other third are scattered across the for-profit, nonprofit, and special purpose districts. So thank you for that. Laura, if you could go ahead and launch the second poll question, please.
All right, the second poll that we have is, what size water and or sewer system does your utility operate by number of people served? And the answers are very small with 500 or fewer, small 501 to 3,300, medium 3,301 to 10,000, very large or very large for 10,000 or above, or not a water or sewer utility. And I'll just give a couple more seconds for people to send their answers in.
And for this question, we sometimes get confusion about what we mean when we say people served. We mean individual people. So divide that by 3 or 2.5 to come up with number of accounts. We're not talking about 10,000 accounts. We're talking about 10,000 individual people, which is close to about 4,000 accounts.
All right, and here are the results.
All right, so it looks like obviously we know about a third of you are not from systems, but for the rest of you, most are in the small or medium category, and then we have some in the very small and a few in the large as well. So, you know, I think obviously this particular funding from EPA focuses on those 10,000 or fewer people served, but we are happy to take questions from the larger systems as well, because we know that you all have very similar issues to what we see for the smaller systems. All right, I think without further ado, we are ready to get into the questions here. So, as I said, we had a few pre-submitted questions that we'll start with and then continue. I know some of you are putting some questions into the question box, so thank you for that. Continue to do that throughout the course of the webinar. But I'm going to ask Shadi the first set of questions here. And we noticed from the pre-submitted questions that there were some themes that emerged. So we're actually going to start with 3 questions that I think are pretty well related. So one was a participant had asked that their rates are currently too low to sustain the system, just looking for general guidance on how to set effective rates. Another participant asked what's the best method to use for rate structuring, and still another asked maybe the bottom line question, what is the right amount to charge? So Shadi, what is the right amount to charge?
Yeah, nothing like starting with a webinar with a very simple and easy, quick question to answer. So let's get started. I personally a data person, so when I get asked that question, my first instinct is, oh, I want to see the numbers, I want to start crunching numbers. I would advise against that. Really the first thing you need to be doing is stepping back and reviewing where you are with the water system and seeing if everything is intact before you try to adjust anything. So every year, we always recommend that systems at least review the rates every year. Doesn't mean you have to change your rates, but at least do the assessments every year. Before you even start looking at revenues and costs and all the numbers, it's important to go back to what's the vision, what's the mission of the water system? What exactly does the council, the commissioners, the boards, or if you own the water system, what exactly are you intending to do with the water system? What kind of level of service have you agreed to provide to your customers? Are there specific objectives that you're trying to achieve? If you're a utility, for example, that's out west right now and you're in a drought, you might be trying to encourage conservation. Or if you're a utility that's has a lot of excess capacity and you're trying to encourage businesses to move closer, then you have a different rate setting objectives. And it's important to have that context in mind and to come up with these objectives and what the mission statement is and the vision statement is before you even start tackling the question of setting rates. And that will help structure the rate structure design itself better before you start putting in the numbers and try to create the revenues that you're looking for. So starting off with the vision and mission, knowing what your objectives are, the next thing I would recommend is to also just either be familiar with your customer base or go out and, if you're new to your water system, learn about your customers. Who makes up your customer base? Are you a system that serves primarily just residential customers, or do you serve a mix of non-residential and residential? Do you sell water to other systems as well? Are you a bulk provider? And even if you are a residential only or residential primarily customer base, do you have a lot of customers that like to irrigate, water their lawns, wash their cars in the summer, or is it usually, or most of your customers living in multifamily homes or the small apartment complexes? Knowing what your customer base is will help you understand how your customers are using their water, which will then help you figure out how to price your water. Because if your customer base, for example, is very seasonal, they like to irrigate in the summertime, but you're in a drought situation, then you might need to set very, very high rates for high consumption in order to encourage conservation, in order to encourage your customers to use less. So we're getting closer to answering the question of what is the right amount, and it's first answering what's the right structure before you come up with what the right price is. So knowing your customer base is important. And if you have that context in mind, if you already know all this, you've been working with the water system for a while, nothing's really changed in your objectives, nothing's really changed with your customer base, take a look and see what your financial situation is, what your financial condition has been. Are you, in the past 5-10 years, have the revenues been coming in enough to pay for your operating expenses? Are they enough to pay for your operating expenses as well as capital? What about debt service? Do you have enough cash on hand, or do you need to build that up? Do you have a reserve account or a capital reserve account? What's the condition of your financial system? And if nothing seems to be broken, then you don't have to change very much. But also pay attention to your changes to customer behavior as well. So are your customers using less water every year? And if that's the case, you might have to raise rates every year to compensate for the reduction in average demand. And we mentioned that quite a lot in our webinars, because nationally we see that about 2/3 of the systems have a declining average demand, which if you don't change your rates to accommodate for that, you'll find out very quickly that your revenues are not just what they used to be, while your costs keep going up and your revenues keep going down. So knowing what's changing is important. All right, so now you know the background. Ask yourself the question, is your rate structure the right design? And we have a whole webinar that we've recorded before, very specifically answering this question: how do you set your rate structure? How do you design the rate structure to meet your objectives? So a utility that's trying to encourage conservation, increasing block rates or increasing tiered rates, as they're sometimes called, having low base charges and high volumetric rates, that will look different than a utility that has excess capacity and they're just trying to generate enough revenue to pay for their expenses without having to worry too much about setting a price signal for conservation. And if you have an affordability problem, if you have a large service population that has low income and they're not able to afford what the average price is, then you might have to set a different rate structure design to accommodate that. So ask yourself every few years whether or not the rate structure design that you're using still makes sense, or if you need to change that increasing block rate structure to a uniform rate or a flat rate, or if you need to change the balance between how much you want to get from your fixed charge, your minimum charge versus your volumetric rate. And then the last part, which is I think what some of these questions are specifically asking for, but I think that all this background information is important. How do you price it? If you think that the rate structure design is correct, nothing's really been changing very much. You just need to make sure that the price you set for next year is going to be sufficient to generate enough revenues to pay for all your expenses. There's a whole book from AWWA called the M1 Manual, and the title of it is Principles of Water Rates, Fees, and Charges. It's a pretty thick book. It talks about cost of service pricing. That's sort of seen as the Bible, or the main guidelines for setting rates. And really all that is trying to say is you want set rates that are equitable. So you don't charge, or you charge customers proportional to how much they're costing you as a customer. So customers that have a lot of peaking demand, have a lot of seasonal demand, you would charge them higher rates, or you generate more revenues from them than customers who use steady amounts every single month. Low customers would pay less, high use customers would pay more because it costs you more to serve them. I probably don't have a lot of time to talk about the exact cost of service methodology in here, but that is something that we could work with you one-on-one if you have very specific questions about cost of service methodology. But for pricing, how do you actually calculate what the prices need to be? Let's say you have a very simple rate structure. You have one rate structure for all customers, residential, non-residential, all meter sizes are treated the same. You just have one simple base charge for all customers and a volumetric rate, a uniform volumetric rate. Then if you know what you would start by calculating what your expenses are going to be next year. You need to know how much you need to be generating. That's a revenue requirement. You would need to know what your expected water use levels will be next year. And you can find that out by looking at your records for the past couple of years or longer and do a trend line analysis and see what the average demand is, what the low demands and what the high demands are. If you know a sort of a distribution, or at least the average demand for next year, then you would start crunching some numbers in order to make sure that the revenues you get from the base charge that you set times the number of customers that you have times 12 months or 6 bi-monthly periods, that plus the volumetric rate that you charge times the volume that rate would apply to. Take those two together. If they equal the revenue, the expenses that you're expecting to pay next year, then you're all set. Couple of tips. One, if you're raising rates, you should expect that customers are going to react by reducing their demands. It's a well-known principle in economics called price elasticity, but that doesn't matter. Really, it's just we've seen it happen. We've analyzed it ourselves. As you raise rates, in general, if you raise rates about 10%, the average rates go up by 10%. Water use customers, on average across the entire United States, drops somewhere between 2 to 5%. But that's an average nationally, and each utility will have a very different reaction, very unique situation. So you can use that as a rule of thumb, but don't let that be the only measure that you use. So if you're expecting to raise rates, you might need to raise rates a little bit more to compensate for reducing prices. I think I'm going to stop here, and if you have more follow-up questions about this specific topic about pricing and how to calculate a price, let us know, and we can circle back to it. But I'm seeing a lot of questions coming in right now, so I want to move on to the next topic. I will also say that we have a tool that's available for water systems called the Water and Sewer Rates Analysis Model. If you go on our website, efcnetwork.org, and search for Water and Sewer Rates Analysis Model, we have a cash flow model in there that does a lot of things I just mentioned, where you put in what your costs are going to be, you put in what your expected rates are going to be, and it will tell you whether or not those rates are sufficient to generate the revenues you need to pay for your expenses. And we've worked a lot with water systems directly one-on-one using that tool. So that's something that we can provide assistance with as well. All right. I'm going to switch over and ask a question that just came in. The question is, which expenses should be on the monthly service charge versus the water volumetric rate, the quantity charge, the uniform rate or increasing block rates? I'm going to let Glenn answer that question. It actually doesn't mirror another question that we received before which is how much of the total revenues should come from the fixed monthly charges versus the variable consumption charges. What should the minimum rate be? That was the essential question.
Yeah, and so thank you for all three of you for submitting this question, and I think it really ties in with what Shadi was talking about of understanding, what you're looking for in terms of revenue requirements. But I think one of the biggest challenges that water systems have is this balance versus fixed and variable charges, and part of the reason is that for most water systems, our experience is that the vast majority of your expenses are fixed. So your salaries are going to be fixed regardless of how much water you sell. The taxes and insurance you pay are fixed. The debt service, if you borrowed money on the system, is fixed. Even the maintenance, by and large, is fixed regardless of usage. The biggest expenses that change over the course of a month or over the course of a year would be things like electricity, chemicals, and then if you purchase water from another system, the amount of water that you purchase is obviously going to be tied in with how much you sell. So it's not unusual for a water system to have 50, 60, 70, 80% fixed costs. But when we actually look at the revenue side of the ledger, oftentimes the base charge represents maybe only 20 to 30% of the revenue, and the other 70 to 80% of the revenue is coming from the variable charges, or the amount that's charged per gallon. And so obviously there's a mismatch there. And I think the danger of that is that we make assumptions when we set rates about the number of gallons we're going to sell in a given year. And if for some reason we don't sell that many, if there's a drought or a large customer leaves, then we could end up with a revenue shortfall. So, so that's the kind of basic background that I think is really essential for answering this question of how much should be fixed versus how much should be variable on the charges. Now, that being said, if we were to price water in such a way that every customer paid a fixed charge per month or per quarter that equaled the fixed charges, their share of the fixed charges of the utility, and then only charged a smaller amount for volume, what you would end up with is a very high base charge and a very low volumetric charge, and it would not necessarily be a good rate structure for somebody, for example, that wants to encourage conservation that Shadi talked about earlier. So we end up with a system where everybody ends up paying a little bit of the base charge regardless of their usage, and then we are asking typically, this is how it's typically set up, higher volume users to pay essentially a little bit more of those fixed costs through the volumetric charges, and then the lower users to pay a little bit less. And whenever we've had this discussion with communities, I think one of the big things that comes up is, what about the widow? What about the, old person living by himself or herself who uses 1,500 gallons a month? If we have a base charge of $50 a month and a volumetric charge of, $1 per 1,000 gallons, which is probably going to get to that 70-30 split, that person is going to have this huge bill for very little usage. And I think generally, politically speaking, that doesn't sit very well. So, setting rates is a painful art. It's not an exact science. And I think that, we would encourage you to think about the percentage of your costs that are fixed versus variable, and actually sit down with your budget or your financial statements and mark off which is which, and then take a look at how consistent your usage is. And if you have fairly consistent usage across the board, you might be able to get away with having a little bit of a lower base charge and a little bit of a higher share come from volumetric. But if not, if your usage varies a lot, or if you're susceptible to weather events that change usage patterns like drought, you may end up having to want a larger base charge and a smaller percentage coming from volumetric. But as I said, the downside of that is that it does discourage conservation. All right, Shadi, another question for you related to cost of service and pricing. How often should rates increase, and by what percentage?
I like this question because it's an easy answer. It really depends. And you should not be setting a goal to raise rates just because that's what everybody else is doing. It really should be driven based on what your individual needs are. So how often should your rates go up? It's whenever you need to have your rates go up. I'm sorry to make that the answer, but that it really is the situation. It's not uncommon for systems to find that if they haven't raised rates in several years, that they have a big hole to fill in and to catch up and have to raise rates significantly. We recommend that utilities don't try to just change rates once every 5 years and have a big increase every 5 years. We always recommend trying to gradually raise rates every year or every couple of years, smaller rate increases over time, as opposed to trying to catch up with a big increase, because that's when customers will really have a hard time paying their bills, and you will hear back from the customers when you're raising rates at 10% or 20%. As far as how much rates need to go up, that should be driven again by the analysis that you do. So you need to look at your own costs, you need to look at your projected costs, you need to look at your current fund balance to see if you're in a hole or if you need to build up your fund balance. That will really dictate what your the rate increase needs to be. I will give you some quick statistics that in a lot of places we've analyzed rate increases in several states, and in places out here in the Southeast, it's not uncommon from one year to the next to find that 40 to 50% of utilities will have raised rates. And utilities in here generally don't keep rates longer than 3 or 4 years. Most utilities will have raised rates every 2 years or 3 years maximum. And it's really rare to have rates that stay for longer than 5 years. But there are some other states where holding on to those rates for a long time is more common. And our analysis shows that eventually they suffer a little bit more than utilities that raise rates in small portions more regularly than having to do a big increase. And when they do, when utilities in these states raise rates quickly or frequently, their rate increases tend to be smaller. So we're seeing half of the utilities raise rates by about 4%, 5%. That's not uncommon in a lot of states. And so you can tell that that's still higher than inflation. Water rates are going up, water and sewer rates combined are going up faster than the rate of inflation, and that's partly because inflation has slowed down quite a bit since the 2008 recession. But rates have been going up in order to catch up with decades worth of just trying to keep the lowest rates possible. And we know now that costs are going up and that you have a lot of capital expenses that are now starting to show up because systems have been built a few decades ago, and all of those pipes are now it's time for them to be replaced. So you have to raise rates in order to generate the revenues and cash to pay for some of these costs.
Okay, all right. And one thing I just want to add to that, we have seen a few small systems that we've worked with that their rates automatically go up every year based on, inflation or 2% or some measure like that. There's an advantage of that kind of approach that at least you don't go 20 years without the rates going up. But I think that the danger in that, what I always caution people in our workshops is, some systems we work with say, oh, we don't need to look at our rates every year because they just go up 2%. So, I think if you have something like that in there, it's good. You don't have to go back to the governing board every year to ask for a rate increase. You'll automatically at least keep up somewhat with inflation. But just be careful that you may need to go to the board and ask for a larger rate increase if that's what you do. And we have some examples of materials that we have on our website of actual statutes that local governments have passed for that type of measure. All right, so this actually ties into a question that came in. How many systems out there that have an annual rate increase driven by ordinance? So there's a few that I'm aware of, at least that we've worked with. A couple of systems in Illinois, I remember, that came to a workshop we did a few years ago. I think it's less common than not. I think it's not a rarity per se, but as I said, I think it is something that we're seeing more and more of now. I will mention, if you're a local government system in most states where your governing board has the final say over rates, this is something you can do. However, if you're a local government system in a state like Wisconsin that has to go through a utilities commission, or a private system that needs to go through a utilities commission, you really want to talk to your utilities commission about whether or not they would be comfortable with something like this. We tend to see it less commonly with those types of systems than we do for the local government systems that have the final say over the rates.
I'll add to this that tying rates to a factor, inflation or the construction cost index, or inflation being the consumer price index, has its pros and cons, and some systems that try to do this do it because they want to ease on the difficulty of raising rates every year, of having to go in front of the board and asking for a rate increase, and the board would say no, not this year, and just keep pushing back on rate increases. So in some situations, it's easier to have an ordinance that says, all right, for the next 5 years, our rates will keep up with the rate of inflation. And if the board approves it, then that simplifies rate increases in the future, because you don't have to go in and fight for it every single time. The con, though, is that those price indices don't really have anything to do with your costs of service, or how the costs at your utility are going up. So inflation right now is about 2% per year. Your expenses might be going up slower, might be going up at 1%, or it might be going up at 3 or 4%, or you might have a big capital project a year from now or 2 years from now, and you really have to raise rates significantly now to start generating the reserve funds that you need to pay for the capital costs. And having an ordinance like that doesn't really help you address those kind of situations. All right, Glenn, I'm going to ask you a question that's related to affordability that's coming from one of our audience members. How do you best determine your median household income when you're setting rates, so that you can measure affordability? And how do you evaluate what's affordable for your community in general? So when folks don't want to pay the true costs of service, and if you set rates at the right levels, you might find customers are not able to pay or not wanting to pay. So how do you evaluate affordability, and if you have some tips on how do you address it?
Yeah, so thank you for these questions. This is a really big issue that comes up very often in the work that we do. And I think one of the things I'd like to start with in talking about this is the difference between your customer's ability to pay versus your customer's willingness to pay. And these are different ideas. You have some customers in virtually every water system that will actually struggle to pay your water bill, just like they struggle to pay every bill that they have. Often in my experience, these are not customers you ever hear from, but they're out there and they are dealing with financial hardships, whether they're on a fixed income or have had an illness in the family or whatever the case is, that we need to be aware of, because water is in addition to being an enterprise fund, is a public service, and we want to at least be thinking about providing an affordable amount of water that people can live off of. Now, that's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum are people who have what we call a willingness to pay problem, or in other words, they maybe don't have the best priorities in life. And I think we all know people like this, people who, I've heard stories from dozens of water systems we've worked with of, one guy was a water operator by day and a DJ at the bar in town by night. And, he had a customer come in on a Wednesday who couldn't afford to pay his water bill. The same customer Saturday night is at the bar buying around the shots for his buddies that cost more than the water bill he owed. So I don't know, maybe he hit the lottery on Thursday, but it seems like, just somebody who maybe doesn't have the best priorities in life. And, so we have to be a little bit careful too about these people, and it leaves a bad taste in our mouth when they're kind of taking advantage of a system that we set up to help those people who are really most in need within our communities. And, you know, I think that there's study after study that has shown that most people, in terms of priorities of bills to pay, will rank water near the bottom, if not at the bottom. And in the rates dashboard that we do for the state of Georgia, we have been asked in the past to include an indicator on there of what the basic cable bill is in that community versus the water bill. Often the water bill is less. In Alabama, they asked us to include the average price of an SEC football ticket as a means of comparison. So sometimes we can talk to customers about the relative cost of water. I mean, a gallon of water coming out of your water system generally costs a penny. There's not much you can buy for a penny anymore these days. In fact, some countries are getting rid of the penny because it's so useless as a means of currency. But, you know, I do think that understanding this difference between willingness to pay and ability to pay is important. And, you know, some of this is really going to be tied to customer communication and how well you are letting your customers know about the importance of providing quality water service, maintaining infrastructure, and meeting public health. And so we want to make sure that we're getting those messages out pretty regularly, talking about things that we're doing well for our customers. And I think the real message that we have in this area is that what you don't want to do is maintain the rates so low that even the poorest person in the community can afford them. If you can do that and meet the full cost of service, more power to you. But I think in general, we find that you may need to set the rates at what they need to be and then look for alternative ways of helping those customers. And that may be through some sort of social safety net program. And I think often there are people in your community who are already evaluating whether households are eligible for that type of assistance. And that's the kind of program you'd like to partner with. So that way you don't have to make a determination if this is someone with a legitimate need versus someone who is, you know, just kind of not interested in paying their bill in general. But to get back to the first question of where's the best place to find the data, I'm actually going to exit out of the PowerPoint for a second here. I want to show you the best place to go for this, which is if you go to the U.S. Census, and what you're looking for is American Fact Finder. There is a treasure trove of great data on your community available here. So you come to this website and it says enter a state, county, city, town, or zip code, and it will say, for example, Atlanta, Georgia. You need to actually ignore that and write it as, you know, I will write it here as Graham City, North Carolina. That's the community that I live in. And then you'll go, and what I would say is go to the income tab here, and then you see right here the median household income, $32,713. But I would actually encourage you to dig into this selected economic characteristics tab. And we have a tool, by the way, that helps with this particular question, and we've done a webinar on it. It's available on our website. But this page here will show you the employment status of people in the community. So who's employed, unemployed, or not in the labor force. It's going to show you income by different buckets. So here in my community, 12% of residents are households are $10,000 or less per year in income. 6% are 10 to 15,000, 20% are 15 to 25, and so on. And then there's also information here about who's on Social Security and who gets supplemental security income, food stamps, etc. So this information can give you a much richer sense of affordability within your community. And then, as I said, we have a really good tool that is available on our website that will help you with this particular question.
Thanks, Ben. I think we also have done a webinar, correct me if I'm wrong, we've done a webinar specifically talking about assessing affordability, and people can view that recording?
Yes, we've done that as well.
Okay.
All right, moving along. So we have a question here for Shadi about depreciation, kind of an interesting subject when it comes to rate setting. So should all of the system's depreciation costs be included in the water rates? And another person asked, I include depreciation in my budget. Should I also include a replacement fund category, or is this double counting?
All right. Well, first of all, congratulations to the two who submitted those questions. It sounds like you're at least thinking about using depreciation. So I'm going to step back a little bit and mention why even bring this up. Why are the systems asking about depreciation and tying it into rates? Because nobody pays depreciation. You never write a check that says depreciation on it and give it something. It's not an actual expenditure. It's an expense, but it's not an expenditure. So why bother setting rates to accommodate depreciation? And the reason for that, particularly for small water systems, is that if you don't already have a system in place to account for future capital costs and to set those costs in your rate model, in your calculations, in a way to raise rates enough to be able to save money ahead of time to pay for your capital expenses in the future, or at least to be able to afford debt service in the future if you're going to take on any debt, then you are putting yourself in a very difficult financial situation. And that's very, very common, unfortunately. A lot of systems have just tried to balance their budget, their annual budget. They would set rates to make sure that they have enough money coming in every year to pay for salaries, to pay for chemicals, to pay for power, to pay for the short-term expenses without really thinking about capital expenses. We're talking about rehabilitation or replacement of the water lines, of a pump, of a well, of paying for an engineering study if you have to do some kind of expensive and complicated construction work. So if you have a system in place, and the best way to do that really is to create a capital improvement plan, an asset management plan, and a capital improvement plan. And we've done several webinars on those topics. We have another tool. By the way, when you keep mentioning tools, these tools are all available for free on our website. If you go to that website that you see on the screen right there and just click on resources and tools, all the tools we're mentioning are there for you to download and use on your own. But there's a tool up there that will help you create a capital improvement plan. You would do that, you would know what your capital expenses are going to be in the next 5 years, and then you would use those numbers that you calculate to put into your rate model in order to make sure that the rates that you set this year and next year are going to generate the revenues to pay for your short-term operating expenses, as well as your future capital costs as you've actually calculated them. Now, let's say you don't have that, and a lot of systems don't have a capital improvement plan or asset management plan. The short-term fix for that is to budget for your depreciation. At least that way, depreciation shows up as an expense, it is an expense. It will show up as sort of an expenditure that you need to set rates for to be able to cover with your revenues. And that way you will set those rates, you'll get the revenues, but what you'll find out, and this is key, is that you'll be generating a lot more revenues than you're paying for in short-term operating expenditures, because there's no such thing as depreciation expense. So the key there is you need to be using that money that you've set aside for, or you've budgeted for your depreciation, for actual capital projects. Don't just sit on that money and think that you have a great surplus coming in every year and you don't know what's going on. You're creating that surplus because you need to be spending that money on capital expenses. Depreciation is not a very accurate way of calculating what your capital expenses are going to be in the future. Depreciation tells you how much your assets have run down this year. So theoretically, if you set aside money, the same amount of money to compensate for how much those assets have been run down or have been used up this year, then next year you can use it, or you can build that up over time and then rehabilitate that asset to bring it back to new. But depreciation is always being calculated using past expenses. The past purchase price, you might have put that pipe in 10, 15 years ago, and you're depreciating based on 10, 15-year-old data, whereas future capital costs are going to be more expensive than past capital expenses. So depreciation alone is not a very good thing. All right, but to answer these questions specifically, if you already have a capital improvement plan, if you already have a replacement fund, if you know what your future capital costs are going to be, and you're setting rates to pay for those capital costs that you have in a capital improvement plan or budget, you don't need to be setting aside extra to cover depreciation, because when you do the capital projects, you're going to be replacing and rebuilding those assets anyway. But if you don't have that in place, then you want to set budgets to accommodate at least depreciation expense and have revenues coming in, and then spend that money on capital expenses. All right. Glenn, I'm going to ask you a question about communication. There are several questions that have come in, and actually this question I'm going to read out directly. This person would like to hear a discussion on strategies to convince the board, convince the local elected officials on raising grades, as well as the mechanics of doing that. So how do you communicate with them? What's the best way for water systems to justify needing to raise rates, and not just the governing boards, but also the customers?
All right, well, thank you for those questions. We actually did a webinar on this exact subject about 6 or 8 months ago that I led, and so we'll make that, it's available from our website, the recording of it, but let me give you some of the highlights from that discussion. First off, we talked sort of broadly about the strategies that you can use to communicate to boards and to customers, and then also talked about some findings from a nationwide survey we did of water systems. And I think in terms of the high-level points of this particular question, a couple of things come up. I mean, one is that Shadi mentioned at the very beginning of the broadcast that he's a data guy. And, you know, I'm a recovering English major, and I like to pretend I'm not a data guy, but I am a data guy too. And I think those of us who are data people tend to talk in data, and we tend to talk in hard numbers. And oftentimes, I have to say, that's not a good strategy for talking to boards or to customers. I think, you know, we really want to think about what is the impact on human lives of not doing a good enough job of keeping up the system. And just to give you an example, there was a large water system that our colleagues worked with some years ago who had presented to their governing board what looked to me, and I'm sure would have looked to Shadi, like some pretty compelling numbers of how far behind they were falling in their capital planning and how much money they needed to be investing in infrastructure, but it did not move the board at all. Shortly thereafter, the local newspaper, the paper of record in that area, started publishing articles whenever there was a break in a water line in the water system, which for this system was about once per day. It was a larger system. And now all of a sudden the water folks get called back before the governing board that says, well, what's going on with all these water leaks we keep reading about in the newspaper? We're hearing from our constituents. And they said, well, you know, remember when we were here a month ago and told you we needed money and you said no? Well, this is why we needed the money. And I think, you know, they really missed an opportunity to have said the why from the beginning. So, you know, how often do we expect the system to be out? How many customers will be impacted? These are all the types of things that we can talk about. Because you're starting from a mindset that a lot of people think that water should be free or water is free. And, you know, I've heard plenty of people say, well, here's a bucket, there's the river, go get what you want. But, you know, the truth is, if we want to deliver high quality, safe water on demand to customers that isn't going to kill them, it's the service that costs money, not the water itself. And so, you know, stressing that and talking about what's going well in the system is something I think we do a particularly bad job of. Talking about, you know, what needs improvement and what the potential impacts on humans is. You know, X number of houses are out every time we have a water break. It means we have to close lanes in the street when people are trying to get their kids to school or get to work. You know, these are the types of things that really resonate well. You know, the other thing that I'll say is, and I'm sorry to say this because it's kind of a cynical thought, but, you know, we never want to let a crisis go unused. And, you know, I think in infrastructure, the big one that we've always pointed to in our trainings was the Minnesota bridge collapse several years ago. And there was a lot of attention paid to the state of our bridges at the time. And, you know, I think that that's something that, you know, a lot of people focused on for a month or two, and a lot of improvements were made in roads and bridges for those that took advantage of it. And so the cynical thing I just have to say is that the situation in Flint right now is our Minnesota bridge collapse. You know, there's a lot of attention right now to what's gone horribly wrong in this community, and, you know, less attention to what's gone equally horribly wrong in many other communities. And this may be an opportunity to say, you know, we have to be very careful about our infrastructure and make sure that we have, you know, good infrastructure in place to protect public health in our communities. So those are some of the thoughts that I would have. If you have a chance to go back and rewatch some of that webinar, you'll see that there was a really big disconnect between what the staff thought the board wanted and what the board actually wanted. And my advice there is just meet with the board as often as possible to talk about the water system, ideally on a monthly basis.
And building relationships between boards. We found that a lot of board members have also said, as well as the utility staff, that building relationships over time will make the communications a lot easier. And it goes without saying, but it actually, it's an important lesson for a lot of systems. Don't shy away from the governing board. You want to actually be trying to meet with them and to talk with them, even if it's a difficult conversation. But the more that you have those discussions, and the more trust is built between the two groups, and the more understanding that there's going to be. I've seen a lot of questions come in asking about wastewater versus water. I'll say that a lot of what we're talking about, we keep mentioning water because we're doing this as a series for water systems specifically, but a lot of things that we're talking about also applies to wastewater, whether it's wastewater rate setting or wastewater, how do you deal with wastewater issues. On the technical side, it might be different, but on the financial side, it really is basically the same thing. We have a question in here that was asking whether or not utilities can charge different customer classes different rates. And the question came in suggesting that in their state, the state prevents charging customers different amounts based on the type of customer they are. And can you answer that question, whether or not customer classes are allowed, when is it not allowed?
Yeah, and thank you for this particular question. And I think to give the overarching unsatisfactory answer of it depends on the state is certainly true. But generally speaking, we have seen that most states that we have worked in will allow a different charge based on a customer class. So in other words, a residential customer could be charged differently from a commercial, which could be charged differently from an agricultural customer, for example. That generally is allowed if you can make the argument that there is a rational nexus between what you're charging them and why, as a different type of customer, they deserve a different type of charge. What we have also occasionally seen, and it ties back to our earlier discussion of affordability, is that in many states we have seen systems try to charge customers a different charge based on their income, or in some cases, you know, the church in town gets a different charge from everybody else or something like that. Now, again, there are some states, Washington State being one of them, where this is perfectly allowable, at least the affordability pieces. But in most states, this is not. Charging somebody a different rate because of their level of income is not thought to be appropriate under most state constitutions if you're at least a local government system, because of kind of equality of, you know, government equality and things like that. And so, you know, I think in most states you can make an argument based on the customer classes, but in most states you can't make it based on something like, say, income. But again, I would urge you to check with your state regulators or perhaps with your town attorney.
All right, we are getting close to the end of our time here, but I'm going to answer 2 or maybe 3 questions that are relatively short in quick succession. One was asking, larger systems usually do a 5-year cost of service study where they would hire a consulting firm that would come in, do a really in-depth analysis using the M1 manual methodology. Should water systems do the same thing? And the answer to that is, If you're going to bring in rate consultants, I don't think you need to be doing that every single year. I think that a 5-year plan might work. It might still be too expensive. So whoever you bring in to do a cost of service study, I would recommend that you ask them to leave behind a rate model that you can then use, and they can train you how to use that rate model to adjust, to tweak the rates from year to year until you do another cost of service study. So a 5-year study sounds fine if you can afford it. Otherwise, there are some free tools available, and we are available as a free resource to help the systems work through some of the rate setting objectives. We can't do a full cost of service study because that just takes a lot of time, and we don't have the resources to be able to spend that much time with systems. But we can answer a lot of questions, and we have those tools already pre-built to help you with that. Another question asked, how would one calculate a short-term construction rate? I think that's related to, like, how would you project what construction costs are going to be? And it's specifically asking about rates. So I think that question might be about indexes. I don't think that you should use inflation or consumer price index to inflate capital or construction costs. There's a separate index called a construction cost index, CCI, not CPI. And construction cost index is calculated I think every quarter. We have a blog post on that on our website. If you go to efc.web.unc.edu, and I'll mention that again later on in a minute. But if you just Google EFC blog post construction cost index, we describe what that index is and why that's a good index for projecting capital costs. And we even have a graph that shows what those rates are. I'll tell you right now that the rates are about 3% per year. The regular inflation rate is about 2% per year. And quick last question is, can we raise late fees? We are now at 10% for late fee. Glenn, you want to answer that quick one?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the answer here, again, it goes back to this notion of there being a rational nexus between the charge you have and the cost that you incur. You know, I would say for a late fee that, you know, you can have a late fee of a certain percentage. 10% is probably something common that we see, but what you may want to pay particular attention to as well would be the charge that you would have for shutoff and reconnection. So even more so than the late fee, what's the charge that you're giving? There are very many systems that we work with who actually every time they shut off a customer and reconnect them, they lose money because they don't charge enough. And so I think it would be important to look at that cost. But without having a lot of data right in front of me, I think 10% as a late fee is certainly a reasonable charge that we've seen many systems do, and probably even a little bit higher.
All right. I think that might be all the time that we have for questions. We're right at the top of the hour. So I'd like to thank you for joining us. I think Glenn has maybe a couple of...
Yeah, we just have 2 quick poll questions as people are getting off, and Laura's going to go ahead and launch those. So one is about technical assistance for your water system. So if you are a small system serving 10,000 or fewer people and you are interested in some one-on-one help, which is free to your system other than the time that you have to give us, you are welcome to answer this poll question. And if you say yes, we will follow up with you individually. So we'll give you a minute to answer that.
And of course, if you don't answer this question, you can always go to efcnetwork.org and click on assistance, which was the slide that we had up for quite some time. So efcnetwork.org, that's the website.
Okay, Laura, let's close that one out. And
the next one.
One last question just before you all leave. Shadi mentioned that we have a blog where we talk about environmental finance topics. And if you're interested in subscribing to the blog, you'll get a post about once a week on an environmental finance topic. And if you just answer yes here, we'll just go ahead and sign you up for that automatically.
And this is the same blog site that I mentioned where we have a blog post on construction cost index. We've also written blog posts about myths when it comes to rate setting for small water systems. We've written blog posts about lessons from Flint, analysis showing violations versus rate setting. We have blog posts on affordability. So there's a lot of topics that are related to small systems as well as large systems that we write about.
All right, and I'd say beyond that, thank you for your answers. We can go ahead and close that poll out. And if we did not get to your question today, I apologize. We had a ton of good questions come in. This is the first time we've done this format for drinking water rate setting. We'll probably do it again. But what Shadi and I will do is we will follow up with you individually with answers. So just be a little patient with us. We've got a lot to get to, and it's a holiday week for us this week here on campus as well. Please join us for future webinars, and you've got our emails and phone numbers if you have any specific questions, and then also you've got the ability to go to the website, as Shadi said, to request the one-on-one assistance. So thanks so much for your time today, and we'll be talking to you soon.
Thank you all, and you should be seeing a quick survey at the end when you close out of this evaluation for this webinar. So any information, any feedback you provide for us will help us plan for the next webinar as well. Thank you, everybody.
All right, thanks, everybody.